Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in Genesis chapter 46. Most people have had to move homes from time to time, probably multiple times, and if you have never done that in your life, consider yourself blessed and lucky to be one of the rare ones that's never had to pack up everything and relocate. Moving from one place to another can either be a refreshing adventure or it can be a pain in the rear, depending on your perspective. When I was a little kid in Wyoming, my family moved around from place to place within the same area, and I would get excited. I'd get a new bedroom. There's new places to explore, and I really loved the houses that had old barns and basements. But when I moved 1,300 miles to Oklahoma, it was a huge change. Now, I've noticed that as I grew up and as I faced the world on my own, moving is less fun and it's less adventurous and it's a hassle. You have no idea how much stuff you actually have until you move. And I don't know why, but have you noticed that you subconsciously label your stuff as stuff and everybody else's as junk? Put your junk over there with my stuff, and my stuff will go in this box with your junk. When I built my house, it was just me and my 3 kids, so I had no idea how much junk we had accumulated in the last 13 years. I mean, tools and project cars, barns full of stuff, childhood items. It took forever just to move 2 miles. In fact, I filled up several dumpsters full of stuff I didn't even know we had. Now imagine the logistics of moving a family of 70 people over 200 miles. Without a U-Haul van and without trailers. Jacob is 130 years old in our text today. He has plenty of adult sons to help, but we don't want to overlook how stressful of an ordeal this is going to be for him and his family. For the next 3 to 4 weeks, they will cover about 200 miles in donkeys and bumpy wagons. Now, the wagons of Egypt were luxurious compared to others, but they're nothing like today's air-conditioned cars and soft seats. There were kids and little babies running around whom we're going to see the names of here, and what livestock was still remaining with them, as well as everything else they had accumulated their entire lives, was packed up. And Jacob is leaving everything he had ever known behind. He's leaving his home. He's leaving the land that 3 generations of his family had worked and lived on. And he knew that at his age, he wouldn't see Canaan again in his lifetime. The logistics of a move like this are just staggering. I imagine that the famine further complicated things as well. It had to be heartbreaking, riding through the land in a fancy Egyptian chariot with everybody in your family intact, and you passed homes that had lost their crops. They'd lost their livestock, and even people had perished due to the famine. Everywhere you turn, there's dust and withered plants, bones of cows and donkeys and horses littering the roadways. I'm not trying to bring everybody down and depress you before the study. I just wanted to paint an accurate background of the world at that time and try to grasp some of the emotions that the move that Jacob and his family were about to make held for them. But for the first time in a long time, that old man had something he's been missing for over 20 years, and that is hope. Hope is that his long-lost beloved son, who is reported to be alive and doing well, that empty place in his heart that had been filled with pain, is soon going to be filled with joy, and his belly is going to be filled with bread, and he's going to have grandchildren on his knee that he hasn't even met yet. So let's begin chapter 46 with verses 1 through 4. So Israel set out with all that he had, and came to Beersheba, and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. God spoke to Israel in visions of the night, and said, "Jacob, Jacob." And he said, "Here I am." And he says, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will close your eyes." Though Pharaoh had told them not to be concerned with possessions because Egypt's going to provide for them, Jacob and his family still brought everything they had. It's good practice not to impose on someone that's trying to help you. Don't be an unnecessary burden if you can help it. But shortly after leaving home, he and the family made one last stop at Beersheba, as it said in verse 1. Beersheba was as far south as you could get and still be in the promised land. This stop had held extremely high sentimental value behind it. His grandfather Abraham had dug a well there. Abraham had lived there after the event where he was ordered to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah and was prevented from doing so. Jacob himself had lived there as a young boy with his parents Isaac and Rebekah and his brother Esau. That's the place that had all of his childhood memories, and also the memory of him fleeing for his life. After that time, he impersonated his brother and got the blessing of his father by deceptive means. It was there in Beersheba that God had appeared to Hagar as she had fled from Sarah. He had appeared to his father Isaac, and now he appears to Jacob one more time. Jacob wanted to make sure this is God's will. Now, we, the reader, we know everything that Joseph has gone through. God's fingerprints were over every event that happened. He had this whole thing planned for hundreds of years. Long ago, God told Abraham that his descendants would leave the land, and they would go into another nation, and they would be there 400 years and endure harsh servitude. But they would emerge numerous and wealthy, and the promised land would be physically theirs when everything was over. I'm assuming that Abraham never handed that bit of information down from generation to generation. Maybe it was just Jacob making sure that this was the right thing, even though his son Joseph had summoned him, because he remembers his grandfather Abraham had gotten into a big mess when he went to Egypt during a famine. Isaac was stopped while on his way to Egypt and warned by God not to go there during a famine. And now, during a famine, here's the third generation making its way towards Egypt, a land of over 2,000 false gods and idols. So I can't blame Jacob one bit there. He didn't read the chapters we did that explained everything. He is stepping out in faith, but he still wants assurance that this is God's will. In verse 2, the Lord called out Jacob by name twice, just like he did with Abraham, with Samuel, with Martha, and with Saul of Tarsus. Can you imagine the thrill of God knowing your name? You know, in the past few years, I've gotten excited over a few online conversations with semi-famous people. Some musicians that I happen to enjoy, some authors, and just when they post something or in one of their videos, they mention my name, and I look over at my wife and I'm like a little school kid. I'm like, he said my name, and I'm all squealing with excitement and everything. And she calls me a fanboy when I get like that. Brothers and sisters, the God of the universe, who made everyone and everything, knows your name. He knows more about you than your closest friend. He knows you better than you know yourself. And I think we should all geek out over that little bit right there of that comforting fact that God knows our names. In verse 4, the Lord assured Jacob that he would be with him the whole way. He says, I will go down with you to Egypt. You know, living around Canaanite neighbors who worshipped idols, Jacob had seen how they had the idea that their gods were limited to certain areas. Every region had a god that was specific to that area only. You know, many times I've called God the God of Israel, but God is not limited to just Israel. He might be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he also wants to be your God. Jacob would not be leaving an area that God was somehow chained and tethered to. As the creator of the planet and the entire universe, God can be and is everywhere. And God also told him, I will surely bring you up again, and Joseph will close your eyes. So Jacob will be living the rest of his life in Egypt, but he will be with Joseph. And that's comforting enough. That's what he wants. But the whole time, his heart had been set on being buried in the cave at Machpelah, where his father and his grandfather are buried. God assures him that he will not remain in Egypt after he passes away. And we're going to see the fulfillment as we reach the end of the book of Genesis later. But for now, let us get verses 5 through 7. Then Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob and their little ones and their wives in the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They took their livestock and their property, which they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and came to Egypt, Jacob and all his descendants with him, his sons and his grandsons with him, his daughters and his granddaughters, and all his descendants he brought with him to Egypt. Now, I'm pretty sure that wagons didn't have rear view mirrors in them, so I bet Jacob spent a lot of time looking back at the place that he had called home his whole life. This would be the last time his eyes would see the promised land as an inheritance to his family. His childhood home is fading into the distance as he moved on to a new life somewhere else. Verse 6 reiterates how they had packed up everything. Jacob was all in. He left nothing behind. He also had the assurance that his family would one day be back. But for now, nothing was left behind. When he left Laban's place and he fled for home, he was busy shuffling his family around like chess pieces on a game board. He was planning, strategizing, preparing for every possible bad scenario. He was so stressed out, remember that God sent an angel to wrestle with him and exhaust him so he'd stop relying on his own strength. But this had to be the most peaceful journey that Jacob has ever made. Now, yes, the conditions of the world around them were terrible. The famine was wreaking havoc on the land, and he had just had a heartbreaking goodbye to the place that he called home. But for once, he understood that he is not alone. Jacob finally got it. God is never going to leave him, and he knew he was right in the middle of God's will. Maybe one of these days, I will get it. And I will stop stressing out over every little thing. I'm getting better about it, though. Maybe by the time I'm 130 like Jacob, I will get it completely. Folks, our God has got this. Nothing escapes his attention. If you are living out of the will of God, that should scare you, knowing that God knows everything. But if you are walking with him, you have the peace of knowing that his protective wing is covering you, as it says in Psalms 17, 36, 61, 63, and 91. It almost seems as if God wants us to know that, doesn't it? Let us go on into verses 8 through 15. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel, Jacob and his sons who went to Egypt. Reuben, Jacob's firstborn. The sons of Reuben, Hanok and Palu, and Hezron and Carmi. The sons of Simeon, Jemuel and Jamin, Ohad, Jachin, Zohar, Shaul, the son of the Canaanite woman. The sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. The sons of Judah, and Onan, Shelah, Perez, and Zerah, but and Onan died in the land of Canaan. And the sons of Perez were Hezron and Hamul. The sons of Issachar, Tola, Puvah, and Iob, and Shimron. The sons of Zebulun, Sered, and Elon, and Jalil. These are the sons of Leah, whom she bore to Jacob in Padan Aram with his daughter Dinah. All his sons and his daughters numbered 33. And you just thought we were past all these lists of names, didn't you? I know I probably messed a couple of those up. To keep us from getting lost in this massive list, I've decided to cover these verses in separate groups according to the children of each of Jacob's wives. We all know that the sons were born to Leah and Rachel and two handmaids. We know who they are, but now we're meeting the grandchildren. These verses cover the expanded family that come from his first wife, Leah. We see that the firstborn, Reuben, had 4 sons. Well, I'm sure he probably had daughters too, because many of the brothers also had daughters. Verse 7 also mentions that Jacob had daughters. Now, we know of Dinah, but the word daughters that was used was plural. It was typical of Hebrew writing to only list the names of the male. So many people get hung up trying to figure out where Cain got his wife towards the beginning. We forget that one verse in Genesis chapter 5 5 verse 4 that tells us that Adam had many sons and daughters. When you live for 930 years, odds are that you are going to have hundreds of children. Now imagine if they had one per year, and then factor in the possibility of twins and triplets. But back to Jacob's family. We only know the names of the sons and the grandsons, but the daughters and the granddaughters are there too. They're just not listed in this census. Verse 9 said Reuben had 4 sons, so he has had 2 more since their first trip to Egypt to buy grain. Remember when Jacob refused to let them take Benjamin? Reuben said this in Genesis 42:37. Then Reuben spoke to his father, saying, "You may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my care, and I will return him to you." So in that short time, 2 more sons were born to Reuben. Later, verse 26 clarifies that these names are the names of those that went into Egypt. So these sons weren't born many years after they got to Egypt. So that leaves either Reuben had twin boys or he had more than one wife to get these 2 sons in that short time before they get to Egypt. In chapter 49, there's a piece of this puzzle that gives us the answer to that. And now Reuben was against all that happened at Joseph at the hands of the brothers. Reuben wasn't a perfect guy, and it's revealed to us that he had slept with the handmaid of Rachel, who was one of his father's wives. So either Reuben's wife had twins, or perhaps one of the additional sons come from going with Rachel's handmaid. Verse 10 introduces us to the 6 sons born to Simeon, the second brother. Now, apparently, he wasn't completely faithful either, for the way that this is written tells us that the 6th son was not born to his wife, but born to a Canaanite woman. We don't know much about the marriages and the relationships of Simeon, but that child is singled out from the others for having a different mother. Then verse 11 moves on to Levi having 3 sons. Now we know that the tribe of Levi are called to priestly service. They wouldn't own any land when they enter the promised land, for the Lord is their inheritance. But these 3 sons would form clans that each held specific duties when the tabernacle was built after they would leave Egypt in the book of Exodus. So his sons were Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And by the way, Moses would name his firstborn son Gershom. So Gershom, his descendants were tasked with carrying and maintaining specific parts of the tabernacle, like the curtains, the coverings, and the ropes. And the name also refers to the eldest of Moses' 2 sons, as I said, who was born in Midian. Then Kohath, the founder of the Kohathites. Their primary responsibility was to carry out the sacred objects of the tabernacle. They carried the Ark of the Covenant. They carried the table, the showbread, the lampstands, and the altars. And then there's Merari. His descendants are responsible for the transportation and care of the structural parts of the tabernacle, the frames, the bars, the pillars, the bases, as the Israelites journeyed throughout the wilderness. Then verse 12 introduces us to the 5 sons born to Judah. Now, 2 of the first 3 died in chapter 38. We covered that before. They were extremely sinful, and the Lord took their lives. Now, if you remember, Judah refused to give his 3rd son, Shelah, to their widow, Tamar, as was custom. Tamar got tired of waiting, disguised herself as a harlot, and got pregnant by Judah and bore twins, much to his surprise. One of these twins, Perez, is found in the lineage of Jesus. That's why verse 12 included the information about his 2 children. Hezron, who was named in verse 12, carried on the lineage and had a son who was named Ram. Then Issachar, it said that he had 4 sons, and Zebulun had 3. But verse 33 says all his sons and daughters numbered 33. Camp Leah, by his wife Leah, had 33 people in it, but only 23 living sons are mentioned. I excluded the 2 from Judah who were killed in chapter 38. How can there be 33 when there are only 23 sons named? Well, if you count Dinah, the one daughter we do have a name for, that leaves 9 other people. So 9 other daughters were included, but not named. Now, I couldn't find anything on them, but we are kind of limited for time here, so I didn't dig too deeply into each and every son. But it shows you the importance of these lists, because if you feel like it, there is a gold mine of information that you can find on each and every name. Now, let us continue on into verses 16 through 18 as we take a group of more grandchildren. The sons of Gad, Ziphion and Haggai, Shunai and Esbon, Eri, Arodi, Areli. The sons of Ashar, Imnah, Ishva, Ishvi, Beriah, and their sister Sarah. The sons of Beriah, Hebar, and Malchiel. These are the sons of Zilpah, whom Laban gave to his daughter Leah, and she bore to Jacob these 16 persons. Gad, who was born to Leah's maid, had 7 sons. I wonder if the prophet Haggai had gotten his name from the son of Gad, because the spelling is different, but the pronunciation is similar. Then the other son, born to the maid Asher, had 4 sons, and their sister Sarah was also named, which is rare, by the way. It listed the sons of Beriah, which is unusual to expand that far in this chapter, but we'll find these guys again in 1 Chronicles 7. Their descendants are listed as mighty men of valor at that time. And in fact, the tribe of Asher will have over 26,000 mighty soldiers who are able to do battle. Verse 18 gives us the tally of the 16 people born to Jacob's family through Leah's handmaid. Remember when Leah and Rachel had their baby wars and they tried to outdo each other? Leah might not have had her husband's heart, and she lived life as a third wheel in that relationship, but Team Leah has brought 49 souls to the family at this point. Now we're going to go into verses 19 through 22. The sons of Jacob's wife Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. Now to Joseph in the land of Egypt were born Manasseh and Ephraim, who Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. The sons of Benjamin, Bela, Becher, Ashbel, Gerah, and Naaman, and Ehi, and Rosh, Mupin, Hupim, and Ard. These are the sons of Rachel who were born to Jacob. There were 14 persons in all. Now you remember that Rachel had great difficulty having children. In fact, for the longest time, Joseph was her only biological child. It was Rachel that introduced this maid-sharing thing, making surrogate mothers for her husband. So she herself bore the main character of these final chapters, the mother of Joseph. All of the focus had been on how God used Joseph to save the entire family and many other people. That alone would have been good enough. That alone would have been a great honor. But Rachel did have a second son, and she died giving birth to him. And that is Benjamin, the new apple of his father's eye. We tend to think of Benjamin as this little boy, since he is the youngest, but that is about to be shattered when we count the number of kids that he had before they go into Egypt. First, the children of Joseph, though, Ephraim and Manasseh. We read of their birth shortly before the famine began. These two will grow up to become 2 tribes in Israel, in place of Joseph and Levi, who would need no allotment of land. In the coming chapter, Jacob will adopt them as his own, in a sense, blessing them as he would a son. But take a head count there in verse 21. Little Benjamin had 10 sons. He would be the smallest tribe in Israel, but he's off to a very good start already at populating it. And by the way, there's some notable names that descend from these 10 sons of Benjamin. You have King Saul. You have Mordecai and Esther. You have Saul of Tarsus, who would become the Apostle Paul, and probably many more if you took the time in Scripture to research it. Let's go ahead and get verses 23 through 27. The sons of Dan, Hushim. The sons of Naphtali, Jaziel and Guni, Jezer and Shalim. These are the sons of Bilhah, whom Laban gave to his daughter Rachel, and she bore these to Jacob. There were 7 persons in all. All the persons belonging to Jacob who came from Egypt, his direct descendants, not including the wives of Jacob's sons, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph, who were born to him in Egypt, were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70. Old Dan the man, he only had one son, but a tribe would come from him. So Husham must have had a lot of sons himself. Now I was curious as to why there was only one son of Dan, especially when the name he gave to that one is a plural word that means descendants. There's a passage in the Jewish Talmud that suggests that Dan might have had twins and one of them did not make it, so the verse uses children anyway to remember the family. It suggests that Dan had had other children, but they didn't survive long enough to be recorded as they entered into Egypt. Naphtali, however, added 4 sons to the family of Jacob, bringing the total number of people from Bilhah, Rachel's maid, up to 7. So all in all, Team Leah ended up with 49 and Team Rachel with 21. Now I hesitate to divide them like that, for they became one nation long after the mother's little competition ended. And I also find it interesting that when the nation of Israel would later be divided into 2, with 10 tribes to the north and 2 to the south, each woman would have a tribe representing the northern ones and the other ones. Judah and Benjamin both remained faithful a little bit longer before being exiled with the other 10 tribes. Verse 27 says the people belonging to Jacob were 70 in all when they went into Egypt. Now, just in case you happen to be reading in the book of Acts about the stoning of Stephen anytime soon, you might be troubled when you see a different number than 70 as Stephen recites the history of Israel. In Acts 17:4 or 17:14, Stephen said that there were 75 who went into Egypt. This was because Stephen was quoting from the scriptures that were assembled into what is called the Septuagint. He had that version of the Old Testament, and the Septuagint says 75. The number in the Septuagint isn't wrong. It just included 5 more sons of Joseph, or grandsons, born in Egypt. It includes the rest of Joseph's children. It has been over 200 years since Abraham had his first son, who was supposed to be a mighty nation. And now they have gone from a father and a single son to a family of 70 people. By the time they leave Egypt, there will be over 600,000 plus men able to fight in a war, and a total of almost 2 million people, counting women and children. So God does keep his promises. Let's get verses 28 through 34. Now he had sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out the way before him to Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as he appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a long time. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face, that you are still alive." Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I will go up and tell Pharaoh, and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household, who are in the land of Canaan, have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and herds and all that they have. When Pharaoh calls you and says, 'What is your occupation?' you shall say, 'Your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, that you may live in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians." The fact that Judah was sent out to guide the way shows that there has been a restoration of trust between him and his father. Judah was the one who was the most guilty among all the brothers over Joseph's disappearance, and Judah also got involved in a mess with his marriage and his wicked sons. But now we catch a glimpse of the leadership of what would be not only the most prominent tribe among the 12, but also the royal tribe. I can only imagine the reunion that verses 29 and 30 describe. Words cannot begin to describe the powerful emotions on both sides. 22 years, Jacob had thought that his son had been torn apart by animals, but now he sees him alive and well. On the other hand, 22 years of Joseph not only wondering if his dad was still alive, but trying to figure out what in the world God was doing in his life with all that was happening to him. And now, the emotions of being reunited with his father could only be overshadowed by the wonder of the power and the plan of God becoming crystal clear to him after all of this time and all that he has gone through. In verse 30, Jacob is still fatalistic, Now let me die because I've seen your face. Calm down, old man. You've got another 17 years to be blessed and watch your family continue to grow. But you remember his father Isaac was the same way. He says, bring me my favorite meal so I can bless you before I die. He still had another 47 years of hypochondria ahead of him. But seriously, this was just an expression of a life that now feels complete. His life is full. He is just saying he would be perfectly content if he died now that this has happened, now that he has seen Joseph again. I think of Simeon and Anna and the story of the baby Jesus at the temple. Simeon said that he could die now because he had lived long enough to see the Lord's salvation. Beginning in verse 31, Joseph tells them he's going to go announce their arrival to Pharaoh, which we're going to see in the next chapter. Since they are becoming residents of Egypt, a meeting or an interview is going to be mandatory, even though they were summoned there by Pharaoh and commanded to go live there. And here, Joseph, who is wise to the ways and the customs of Egyptian politics, mentions that there might be something that could be a potential problem. He tells them that Pharaoh is going to ask them what their occupation is. What do you do for a living? How can you contribute to Egypt? Today many people flock to countries like the United States, hoping they can just sit back and be taken care of without working or contributing. The right thing to do is to contribute something to society. If you're able to contribute, you should. It was expected in Egypt, and it should be in all places. But here they are. They're going to be presented to Pharaoh, and he's going to ask them what their skills are so he can know what jobs to give them. And Joseph warns them not to mention shepherding sheep. It was okay to mention the cattle, and they should put emphasis on mentioning the cattle. As Joseph said, just try not to mention the sheep as much. Or as verse 34 puts it, for every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians. This is advice that the family is not going to take, however. In the next chapter, they will openly admit it. They decide that it's better to be honest and truthful with Pharaoh rather than trying to hide something, which could backfire if Pharaoh ever made his way to Goshen to see for himself. So I decided to do a little research. Why did the Egyptians hate the shepherds so much? Most of the commentators said that most cultures thought of shepherds and sheep as disgusting and filthy animals. Well, I'm thinking the Egyptians had cats, and cats can be quite nasty, and the Egyptians worshipped them. So I don't think cleanliness and hygiene was the main reason. So for once, I actually did something that I often say you shouldn't do. I stopped listening to the commentators that are trying to spiritualize their answers, and this time I turned to secular history for answers. And I usually try to incorporate history into these studies whenever it can be beneficial to help understand cultures and places. The animosity between the Egyptians and the shepherds is found in the history of Egypt and the many different dynasties that ruled that country. About 50 years or so before Jacob arrived in Egypt, there was a group of people called the Hyksos, or the Shepherd Kings. They arrived in the northern part of Egypt and settled there. They didn't invade with an army, they didn't do battle, they just migrated there. But in what history calls the second intermediate period of Egypt, the nation of Egypt was fragmented and they were spread too thin. So that allowed these Hyksos people, these Shepherd Kings in the mighty north, to gain power. Some people, and especially Jewish historians, claim that the Hyksos were Semitic people, and they're trying to say, well, this is Joseph and his family ruling over them. But that makes no sense because Pharaoh loved Joseph, and the hatred of the shepherds is already there before them. We just read where Joseph warned them about that. So if they are Semitic people, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the Israelites. Actually, upon further research, the Hyksos were actually Arabic, according to Josephus. Still related to Abraham, so it's Semitic in that way, but they're not Israeli. The antique historians like Julius Africanus and Eusebius say that the Hyksos came from Phoenicia. So the ancient capital of Egypt, where Pharaoh would reside on most occasions, was said to be the city of Memphis. Egypt, not Tennessee. On a map, the area of Goshen, where Jacob and his family settled, was in the far north, quite some distance up from Memphis, quite a ways away from Pharaoh. If this was truly during the early stages of the Hyksos ruling up in the northern territory, that means the capital for the north would have been Avaris, which is where Joseph likely could have stayed. So Egypt was fragmented, and there's nothing they could do to drive out these shepherd kings that had basically taken over in the north. They shared the land with them, but hard feelings were there. Kindness would naturally be shown to Joseph's family because through Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, Egypt would survive the famine that otherwise would have wiped them out. Pharaoh knew that he owed Joseph everything, but Joseph could sense that being shepherds could also make his family look a little bad in the eyes of Pharaoh. History says that eventually Egypt regained control over the northern territory and ruled it completely, driving out those shepherd kings. And I think we might see the beginning of that process in the next chapter, where the famine continued to grow so severe that people from everywhere ran out of money and they would sell their livestock to Pharaoh for food just to survive. And when that money run out, they sold their land to Egypt for food, and they became slaves just so that they could eat and survive. And we're also going to see in the next chapter that by the time all was said and done, Joseph ended up purchasing all of the land, which is now Egypt, for Pharaoh during the worst part of this famine. So the people who had lived there were relocated elsewhere, except for the family of Joseph, who resides in Goshen. They would continue to live there with the blessing of Pharaoh until long after the death of Joseph. And then another king would arise that didn't know Joseph, and that's where the problems would begin. Without the shepherd kings, known as the Hyksos, ruling over the northern part of Egypt, the family of shepherds still remaining there in Goshen presented a problem to the new Pharaoh, who would not know Joseph and everything that had happened. These people in Goshen, to him, were growing too large in number, and to him they could possibly pose a threat to Egypt in his mind.